Tonight is beautiful. I held Tegan's hand as we looked up at the stars from the back porch swing. Suddenly, the door opened and Mr. Nelson, without a word, grabbed Tegan's arm and dragged her inside. I sprang into action and ran behind them. I held on to Mr. Nelson's arm just before it came crashing down on Tegan. Mr. Nelson turned to me and snarled. He grabbed a handful of my clothing in his large hand and lifted me above the floor and threw me through the front door. Tegan screamed as Mr. Nelson came after me on the lawn.
James, please just go. I'll be okay.
Feeling defeated, I held my ribs as I hobbled to my car. Whether Mr. Nelson knew it or not, this was not the end of it. If you want to see how I dealt with Mr. Nelson for his hospitality, keep watching till the end of the video. Luckily for me, I was able to drive myself to the hospital where I called my parents and told them where I was.
What happened?
Mom and Dad rushed into the hospital room just as I was pulling my t-shirt on.
Your son will be fine,
Dr. King said.
A few bruised ribs, but in a few days he'll be okay.
Bruised ribs?
Mom gasped and looked at me wide-eyed. Someone tried to rob me on the way home, but I was able to get away. Mom hugged me tightly and cried.
Paula?
Dad looked at my reddened face.
You're suffocating the boy.
Mom removed her arms hesitantly. Dad turned to Dr. King.
Can he go home now? Yes, he's free to leave.
I thanked Mr. King, and my parents and I left the hospital. I drove with Dad, and Mom drove my car. I was happy Dad suggested I drive with him. At least for now, I got away from Mom's 20 questions scenario. As soon as I got home, I tried to call Tegan, but I only got her voicemail. I wasn't about to let Mr. Nelson ill-treat her or her younger siblings anymore. It was time someone taught that bully a lesson. Before I continue, let me start at the beginning. It all started with pizza. Pizza is my number one fast food go-to. I ordered pizza at least 4 times a week. Orlando, my normal pizza guy, would usually stick around for a slice or two before leaving. However, one afternoon, Orlando didn't show. Instead, when I opened the door, before me stood a tall, slender, long-haired brunette with the most gorgeous sapphire eyes.
That will be $24, sir.
She stared at me. I cleared my throat. Sure. I handed her the money. Where's Orlando? She shrugged.
I don't know. I just deliver pizzas.
I thanked her and closed the door. I ordered pizzas for the next 14 days just to see her. She told me that her name was Tegan. It was almost a month before I asked her if I could take her out on a date. It took another month before she said yes. Over the next few months, I found out that Tegan's mother died. She and her younger siblings, Monique and Josiah, now lived with their dad. While Tegan worked to bring in money for the household and take care of her family, her dad sat around the house watching TV. Why don't you leave? I asked her one evening while we were having dinner.
Well, I can't just leave my siblings and my father will come looking for us. I'll stay and protect them until they are of age to leave. Besides, I promised Mom on her deathbed to look out for my siblings, and I always keep my promises.
I sighed heavily. If you ever change your mind, you know I'm here for you. Tegan nodded but didn't say anything for a few seconds.
Dad wasn't always like that. He was loving when Mom was around. Dad is dealing with Mom's loss just as I am. He's just dealing with it in his own way.
And back to the present. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I knew I had to do something to help Tegan and her siblings. I mean, isn't that what boyfriends are supposed to do to make things easier? I wasn't totally truthful to Tegan about my past and why my parents and I had moved. The truth is, and it's even hard for me to admit it now, I was in a gang. My parents thought it was best for us to move when I was 15, and without the negative influences, maybe I'd be able to make something of myself. I finished school and I was in my last year of college. However, unknown to my parents, I kept in contact with a few of my past friends. The very next day, I contacted Yellows, one of the guys I kept in contact with, and I told him the situation. I told him I just needed him and a few of the guys to scare Tegan's father. I told them about the situation, and all I wanted was for them to scare the father into treating his children better. Yellows and I agreed that the scare tactic would occur the next night. My nerves were on edge the whole of the next day. I couldn't eat and I couldn't drink. I tried calling Tegan again and still no answer. I went to her workplace after class and she wasn't there. I went home that evening and sat on the sofa watching nothing in particular. It was around 10 p.m. on the late night news when a news reporter announced that a robbery had occurred at the Nelson residence. It was alleged that her father was beaten, items were stolen, and Tegan was kidnapped. Kidnapped? I flew up from the sofa and immediately grabbed my phone and called Yellows.
Yo, James, what's up?
Yellows responded from the other side. What in the world did you do? Kidnap? You kidnapped her?
Wait, what? Kidnapped who?
Yellows sounded confused. Tegan! I told you to scare Mr. Nelson, not kidnap Tegan.
James, we did not kidnap Tegan. We just roughed up her old man a bit and tied him up and left.
Turn on Channel 6 News now. The phone went silent for a few seconds before Yellows responded.
James, we've been friends for a long time. I'll never do anything to hurt your girl. Something must have gone down after we left.
I'll call you back. I hung up without waiting for Yellows to respond. Had I made things worse? If Yellows and the boys didn't do it, then what happened? After a week, Tegan was still missing and the police had no leads. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then it struck me. What if it wasn't Yellows? What if Mr. Nelson did something to Tegan and lied about it? I decided that the only way to get answers was to question Monique and Josiah. I waited for them outside their middle school. When they saw me, they hesitated and Josiah held Monique's hand. "Hey guys, how are you? Just wanted to check up on you," I said as they passed me. Neither Josiah nor Monique answered. I walked beside them. "Do you guys know where Tegan is?" Monique looked at me. She looked as though she was about to answer when Josiah said annoyed,
We don't know where she is. We need to get home.
"If your dad did anything to her, you could tell me." Josiah and Monique stopped and turned to me. Just then, a police car pulled up beside us, and the police officer turned to Monique and Josiah.
Kids, is this guy bothering you?
The officer shot me a stern look.
Yes, he is. May we have a drop home, please?
The officer got out of the car.
Sure, no problem.
He opened the back door, and the kids got in. As they drove off, I noticed Monique turned in the back seat and looked at me until the car was out of sight. I got an uneasy feeling in my stomach. My gut instinct told me that Monique and Josiah knew where Tegan was, but were too afraid to say. That night, I parked my car 2 blocks away from Tegan's house and walked the rest. I didn't want anyone to see my car. I wore dark clothes and a hoodie pulled over my face so I couldn't be noticed. I hid behind the bushes until I saw the last light in the house go off. I then waited another 15 minutes to make sure that everyone was asleep before I jimmied one of the windows and entered the living room. I allowed my eyes to get accustomed to the darkness since I didn't want to use a flashlight to make someone on the outside aware that I was in the house. First, I crept to Tegan's room. The scent of her filled my nostrils as soon as I entered. I missed her smile, her laughter, her kisses. I needed to get to the bottom of this quickly. I spent about 15 minutes in her room searching through her papers and cupboards, but came up barehanded. Maybe I should check the basement. If she's hidden, it has to be there, I mumbled to myself. I crept down to the basement and grimaced when the basement door creaked loudly as I opened it. I slid into the basement and left the door slightly ajar. While in the basement, I looked in cupboards. I noticed one cupboard in the corner was chained, and as I walked towards it, I tripped over a floorboard. I stooped and realized that the floorboard could move. Carefully, I placed my fingers under the floorboard and was about to lift it when I heard the floorboard creak behind me. As soon as I spun around, Mr. Nelson punched me in the jaw. I stumbled backwards and crashed into the floor. I blocked my face from Mr. Nelson's attacks until I was able to kick him in the stomach and get away. "You killed her! You killed Tegan!" I screamed. I tried to dodge around Mr. Nelson as I tried to escape, but he was a large man. He grabbed me by my shirt and dragged me up the stairs like a sack of potatoes. As I struggled against him, he got rope from below the kitchen sink, tied me up, and called the police. Sirens blared about 5 minutes later, and Mr. Nelson opened the door for them to come inside.
I found this boy snooping in my basement and I'd like to press charges.
Mr. Nelson smirked. "He killed Tegan. Tell them how you hid her below the floorboards in the basement," I yelled. By this time, Josiah and Monique were awake and peeped from the doorway of their bedroom. One of the officers turned to Mr. Nelson.
Sir, would you like to tell us what this young man is babbling about?
Mr. Nelson looked at me. A wave of uneasiness washed over his face. I smiled.
Sir, we would like to see that basement.
The officer looked from me to Mr. Nelson. "Untie me and I'll show you where it is." The senior officer instructed an officer to untie me. Mr. Nelson stepped towards me and the senior officer stood in front of him and placed his hand on his chest. Mr. Nelson stepped back.
Okay, son.
the senior officer said as I stood up.
Show us where the body is.
Gladly. I glared at Mr. Nelson and pushed past him and went to the basement. With the help of the officers, we removed some of the floorboards. What we saw next changed my life forever. Below the floorboards were beer bottles. The officers looked at me puzzled. Mr. Nelson spoke up.
After Tegan was kidnapped, I promised Monique and Josiah I would stop drinking. I hid these down here so the kids wouldn't see it. But sometimes it's so hard after losing my wife, now Tegan.
Mr. Nelson's voice crumbled to the end of his sentence. He walked back to the living room, followed by the officers and me. Needless to say, Mr. Nelson pressed charges for breaking and entering, and I was given a 1-year sentence with hard labor. Every day that I spent behind those prison walls, I thought about Tegan. I regretted the decision I made and wished I could change it. Living with that kind of regret took a toll on me mentally, physically, and emotionally, which caused me to lose a lot of weight in prison. My parents came to visit me as often as possible, and honestly, if it wasn't for them, I don't think I would have made it out alive. About 6 months into my sentencing, I was out on parole and was warned to stay away from Tegan's house. A few days after my release, while watching television with my parents, we heard sirens outside. Then, someone banged on the door. Mom and Dad exchanged looks before Dad opened the front door.
Good evening, sir. Is James at home?
The officer that stood outside asked.
What's this about? Is James at home? We'd like to question him. About what?
I walked to the door and folded my arms. Talk to me about what?
Monique and Josiah Nelson have been kidnapped. Do you know anything about it? Don't answer that, Dad said. We have been at home with James for the past 3 days. If you need further information, I will give you the number of our lawyer.
Dad stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Mom came and stood beside me and hugged me. I buried my head in her neck and allowed the tears to flow. I couldn't believe this was happening again. Over the next few days, I spoke with the family lawyer and the police. Dad even gave them home security footage to promise I was home during the time of the kidnapping. I was no longer a suspect, at least for now. One evening while I was home alone, someone knocked on the door. I opened the door, but no one was there. On the floor lay a package, which I picked up and took inside. It didn't have a name, a stamp, or a return address on it. In the box were memories that I had with Tegan, pictures, CDs, ticket stubs, and dried up roses. In the box was a letter written by Tegan, where she explained that the night her family was robbed, after the men left, she snuck away. Her father was unconscious, and she told Monique and Josiah that she would come back for them. She said that she and her siblings were now safe, and she hoped to see me again someday. My eyes filled with tears. After I read the letter, I burned it to protect their secret. I was happy she was free from her father, but I was sad that she didn't tell me about it earlier, even though I understood why she couldn't. I provided a way for her to be free, and now I'm at peace. It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all.